It's my great pleasure to introduce another Whitney colleague to moderate this fourth and final panel. David Breslin, who is the DiMartini family curator and director of the collection at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And I'm not going to say anything more because we're just going to keep things moving along. So please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you, Megan, and I'll do my best to keep things moving along as well. I think our session will be great, an opportunity for the great participants and panelists to address the questions that their talks and presentations give, but hopefully to have some time to recap different sessions and have opportunities for people to address the different speakers. I wanted to thank and congratulate, first of all, Donna for the great show, and Christy and Mark and whoever else here who worked on that great exhibition, It Takes a Village, but also to Megan and Izzy and Andy and our colleagues at the New School for putting this all together. When Donna and Megan asked me to moderate this panel, I said, yeah, whatever I can do, and they proposed the title as being Perpetual Warhol, and I said, that's great, you've named the next retrospective in 30 years, so you've done someone a big favor. But I also did that knee-jerk thing that many of us do when they want to kind of get to a word like perpetual, and went to the OED and looked at it and thought how great and perverse it is to use this word that is, the first definition is never ending or changing. And when you think of ending or changing, the radical differences between those words, you put never in front of it to think about an artist for whom change is constant. It's, I think, a great structure to think about all the complexities about Warhol in the present and in the past and what we think about for the future. The other really odd thing in the OED was the first way that they have an example of the usage, which is deep caves in perpetual darkness. And what I loved was the plurality of caves. If we were to substitute caves for Warhol, Warhol's in perpetual darkness, and to think about how many of the speakers today have thought about this great question between opacity and clarity, light and darkness, and what our respective projects bring to Warhol and understanding of his work. So without further ado, I will introduce the speakers in order of which they'll be appearing. Peggy Phelan is the Anne O'Day Maples Chair in the Arts Professor of Theater and Performance Studies and English at Stanford University. Phelan is the author of Unmarked, The Politics of Performance, and Morning Sex, Performing Public Memories. She has written numerous articles and essays in scholarly, artistic, and commercial magazines, ranging from Art Forum to Signs. She has written about Robert Frost, Michael and Paris Jackson, Abramovich, Vertov, and a wide range of artists working in photography, dance, architecture, film, video, music, and poetry. She has edited special issues of the journals Narrative and Women and Performance. She's been president and treasurer of Performance Studies International, the primary professional organization in the field, and she's been a fellow at the Getty Research Institute and the Stanford Humanities Center, and won a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2004. And as you all know, this fall, alongside with Richard Meyer, she co-curated the exhibition Contact Warhol, Photography Without End. Jessica Beck is the Milton Fine Curator of Art at the Andy Warhol Museum. She has curated many projects, most notably Andy Warhol, My Perfect Body, the first exhibition to explore the complexities of the body through beauty, pain, and perfection in Warhol's practice. Her most recent project, Devon Shimayama Crybaby, is currently on view at the Andy Warhol Museum. Beck focused both her undergraduate and graduate research on Warhol. Beck received her Bachelor of Arts in Art History from the University of Chicago and completed her Master's of Arts with distinction at the Courtauld Institute of Art. And last will be Robert Buck. Robert Buck is a transdisciplinary artist, video maker, and writer who in 2008 changed his father's name by a single vowel from Beck to Buck as a work of art. Beck graduated with a BFA from New York University, Tisch School of the Arts Film and TV Department in 1983, and the Independent Study Program of the Whitney Museum of American Art a decade later. Beck was a 1999 Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Award recipient. Trained as a filmmaker, montage, or the cut informs his artistic operation, which thus slides from one distinct body of work to another, a horizontal procedure apt for life in the 21st century. Buck lives and works in New York City and far west Texas. Please join me in welcoming Peggy Phelan.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I feel always when I'm at convenings like this, I'm very aware that I've stumbled into the wrong discipline, which has been a kind of repeated pattern in my career. So I joined the chorus of thanks to Donna and to the entire Warhol team here. And also I'd just like to thank all the speakers because I feel in this day and a half I've learned so much. My talk is somewhat read and somewhat chatted, and there'll be a little bit of silence here and there because I think it's also important to just look at Warhol without blabbing. Perpetual Warhol, a Warhol without end. Recently, Richard Meyer, the brilliantly generous scholar most of you heard speak yesterday, and I co-curated an exhibition entitled Contact Warhol, Photography Without End. And I'd like to explore here some of the slippage and some of the adhesion between thinking of Warhol without end and thinking of photography without end. Sorry. That was supposed to be beautiful. Oh, well. Some of the adhesion between thinking of Warhol without end and thinking of photography without end. To begin then, I'd like to briefly summarize some of the implications of receiving an astonishing large and valuable analog gift in a digital age, particularly when the recipient of the gift is Stanford, a university whose brand aggressively insists on its devotion to technology. The 3,632 contact sheets and negatives, the material artifacts, were in uneven condition. The 11-year performance practice of taking a roll of film a day and storing the negatives and printed thumbnails in a variety of ways left traces of life on them. Some were yellowed, some were stained, some were full of dust, while others were pristine and flat. The quality of the paper, as well as the quality of the exposures, varied a lot. Their overall condition suggested a narrative in which Warhol and his team began with a kind of casual and haphazard approach to the care and preservation of the contact sheets and negatives, and then roughly in about late 1979 and early 1980, Warhol developed, and when I say Warhol, can you always hear Warhol and his team? Warhol and his team developed a more serious and disciplined view of their value. But as with many aspects of Warhol, this narrative is not perfectly neat, and some early sheets were in quite good shape, and some later ones were semi-wrecks. Also, as Meyer points out in the catalog of the show, there was also a fair number of missing contact sheets, and we were aware that Ronnie Coutron's estate had been selling contact sheets of the Hammer and Sickle studies in the private market. We also had some indications that the Warhol Foundation, and perhaps also the Warhol Museum, had taken some extra care with preserving and organizing some of the sheets after Warhol's death. We had a lot of hints, but few firm facts about the order of the sheets, and Amy DiPasquale, who worked closely with us on the project, used primarily the diaries as a way of dating many of the sheets. But Amy herself was, as she likes to call herself, a former club kid, and so she also just knew a lot of the people that Richard and I did not know. But given the various uncertainties surrounding what I came to call the gift that keeps on taking, I am now less interested in aspects of their backstories and much more interested in their future life as digital surrogates, and more on this term shortly. But just to rehearse, I don't know, do you multitask? Have you read all this, or do I need to? Basically, I mean, that's all the facts, but I'll just say the story. Connie Wolf was then the director of the Cantor, and she was invited along with, I've heard different numbers, a certain number of other institutions, to write a justification for why the Cantor at Stanford should receive the gifts. And Connie in turn asked Richard and me to write this justification, and later we found out that Richard wrote a brief email, and I, and we're very aware of the gender politics of this, wrote a 25-page paper arguing that Stanford should have them, in part because their future would be unexpected. That is to say that people such as myself, who were not art historians, would approach them in a way that people from museums and galleries would be unlikely to. And anyway, so long story. So we received them, but I call it the gift that keeps on taking because there were, a lot of legal terms to the gift. Not all of them I'll talk about here, but some of them do bear upon Richard and my conversation about them. So originally, Richard and I went back and forth about his resistance to the idea that the contact sheets were works of art at all. I didn't really think that was a question. And then I started to really understand the art historical perspective, which Donna repeated the other day, that there's some material that is just called archival material or sources or various words like this. But coming from performance studies, I think drinking a cup of coffee is a piece of art. So I didn't even understand it as a question. But then, as is my wont, I read a ton of stuff and I found out, oh, this is actually really very interesting, in part because the whole project is full of ironies. So the Warhol Foundation had argued in a public document, in a legal case, that the contact sheets had zero value because they were indeed archival and scholarly only. They had no commercial value. So they couldn't then turn around and sell this amazing body of work, which made it necessary to donate. But for those of you who know the foundation, the donation is the gift that keeps on taking, because as part of the claim, part of competing for the gift, the institutions had to agree to digitize the files. And it also insisted that a public exhibition of the contact sheets was also required. But there were no provisions about what that public show would look like. And we could have legally just put some tags on the wall with contact sheets and we would have been legally in the clear. But we tried to do something much more interesting, I think. Oh, and the other very big part of the gift was because they were obligated to make this distinction between commercial value and scholarly value. We were able to get permission to print works that Warhol had taken but had never printed before, and during his lifetime. So we called this category Warhol, not Warhol. So these were Warhols that had never been printed. So each contact sheet has roughly 36 exposures. And as we heard earlier from Richard, the coding, which was probably established by Christopher Makos, but also Ronnie Coutron was pretty involved in this whole kind of process, those frames that were not marked with a red grease pen or yellow or green were not printed during Warhol's lifetime. So what we did in the book is we have a plate section called Warhol, Not Warhol, in which we selected frames from contact sheets that have not been printed prior to this, with a lot of real care and precision around the captioning to make that absolutely clear that these are not Warhols, but they are Warhols. Warhol, not Warhol. Okay. And one of the amazing things you can see is how many styles Warhol mastered. He has a kind of Walker Evans phase. He has sorry, I'm blanking, a Weston phase. He goes through all of these different kinds of masters. And then he also is Warhol. So this is Robert Rauschenberg, a beautiful photo session that we printed with the wound, and this was another frame had been printed for the Getty book, in which the comparison was made to Rauschenberg and Vincent van Gogh as the wounded artist that Warhol was trying to sort of slyly rival, I guess. And then, since she's been getting so much attention here, this beautiful contact sheet of Pat Hackett in a photo shoot that we printed this beautiful image, which I think gets at the delicacy of what Melissa called, I thought quite brilliantly yesterday, redaction. The redaction of the banana peel, which has the reference to the banana peel of the Rolling Stone cover, but also the fingers, I think, are really very resonant. And then the other thing that Richard hinted at yesterday, we were very surprised to see the staggering number of portraits of Warhol, or Warhol as a subject, in what was described as the gift of photographs Warhol took. And he was not taking selfies. So some of these, I think, are just really amazing images. Okay. As Richard, I'll do one more and then I'll stop. Okay. So basically what happens between 68 and 76, Warhol is obsessed with his Polaroid Big Shot. And in 76, he buys his first 35 millimeter camera. And he loves it in part because he can put it in his pocket in a way that he couldn't with the Polaroid. So around 76, he switches or doubles his photographic capacity by moving from the 35 millimeter to the Polaroid and back again, A to B and back again. Okay. But as Richard and I began doing research for the exhibition and the book, we realized that working with the actual contact sheets or negatives, or even straightforward scans of the sheets, were really fatiguing, almost impossible. The thumbnail size of the individual frames, coupled with lighting issues that pulled us toward dim illumination for the sake of preservation, and pulled us toward bright illumination to actually see the frames more clearly, posed additional problems. Before long, we preferred working with the contact sheets' digital surrogates, and I became an absolute devotee of digital zoom. And we tried to mimic some of that experience of the joy of digital zoom by having in the exhibition itself a large tablet, an interactive tablet with 110 contact sheets that any spectator could go in and use the digital zoom, which would then be projected on a screen above, so it would become part of the exhibition, which is a kind of performance element that was important to me. Okay. Okay. As I said, the terms required both the exhibition and the digitization. And legally, we were obligated to digitize the contact sheets, but we quickly realized the value of digitizing every single frame. So we went from understanding we would be digitizing 3,600 works to realizing we would be digitizing 336 exposures as separate digital files. And that's one great advantage of working at a place like Stanford, where they say, okay, it's a little more than we thought, but, okay. And that was, I have to say, we did get a lot of support. Okay, but the whole process prompted me to think about the concept of digital surrogates, a term of art for librarians and archivists the world over. While these thoughts were not reflected in the show or the book I did with Richard, they mark a beginning of a new phase of my work with the digital archive. Before turning to this work, I think it is worthwhile to summarize just a few more of the provocations and implications for Warhol studies that we explored. Okay, so any kind of work of archiving a body of work of this scale does generate new insights both about the past and about the present. So I'm just really quickly going to mention a few things about the past. I think looking at all of these sheets gives us new purchase on some of the pop work and some of the post-pop work. So these are the photo booth portraits of Ethel Scull. But you can see, Donna was just talking about Warhol as an art director. He's also an incredible photo editor. And what you begin to see is that his notion of serialization and repetition owes, or you could say that the early work with repetition gave him a certain kind of affinity for the contact sheet as a whole. But you start to look at things in a slightly different way after you've had the experience of looking at so many contact sheets. So everything starts to take on the dimensions or the logic of a contact sheet. Similarly, with Hammer and Sickle, which a lot of people, I think, at this conference have become newly interested in, this is one of the most interesting series, I think, of contact sheets that Warhol did with, again, Ronnie Cutrone, some of which Cutrone has now sold. But what's interesting is they're, traditional portraits of a still life. But in the Warhol's hands, they also become meditations on the themes of communism, or as he liked to say, communism and capitalism. And he'll have, as in here, McDonald's, Wonder Bread, and dollar bills next to the iconic hammer and sight. And I don't have time, but maybe ask about this series again. And then the other thing that for me was just really fun is this difficulty of seeing some of the actual images led us to look at things like this as Richard and I went back and forth. Is it a potato? Is it a melon? What is it? And then we looked at this incredible series that Warhol did called Space Fruit, which I had no idea even existed until I started this project. And you have this, again, this kind of Cézanne-like attention to apples and fruit, but put into kind of post-pop color scheme with attention to the space age and to a kind of alienated or almost anticipatory GMO relationship to fruit and vegetables, which I really love. Okay. In brief, then, the contact sheets were making it very clear that the logic of photography had become Warhol's own logic between 1976 and 1987. Perpetual Warhol, Warhol without end, contact Warhol, photography without end. They asked me if I believed in art. I told them I believed in photography. And here, with Lucy in mind, I'll say the distinction between photography and art is really resonant, that photography is somehow not quite in art at this moment. And again, going fast, I'll just have to suggest, rather than fully argue, some of his articles of faith. To believe in photography means that the copy is as good as the original, and here it's not too much to really literally read it in relationship to Catholicism, made in the image and likeness of. Size is malleable, and here I mean the savior figure, which I think Warhol weirdly sometimes thought of himself as. Okay, you can read all this, right? Okay, I mean, it's just, the last one will be the one I'm gonna really spend the rest of my time on, I think. But I will just say that, as you probably know, Warhol's last show in New York before his death was of the stitch photos he created from printing and enlarging some of the images he had been storing on the contact sheets. Indeed, the stitched photos seem to me to be contact sheets on steroids, thumbnails turned into landscapes. And I have suggested that the code he established with Makos and Cotrone to determine which thumbnail to print by circling the contact sheets with a green, red, or yellow grease marker became displaced into the white thread Michel Loud used to sew the image, to sew the printed images together. So it's a little bit hard to see, but right here you can see that thread. And if you look at them, if you look at all of the stitch photos, the threading is really very interesting, probably random, but if you're psychoanalytically inclined, it also carries the trace, I think, of the printed mark. Okay, I think I'm a little bit longer than I thought. Am I doing all right for time? I have 2 more pages to read. Is that all right? Okay. Before long, Amy DiPasquale began to make the claim that John Gould was the person most frequently photographed in the 130,363 exposures. Jessica Beck relied on Amy's claim for her movingly beautiful argument in our book, Contact Warhol. But as I was editing the book, my Irish suspicion of all facts intervened, and I asked Jessica and Amy to couch that claim by saying Gould was, quote, one of the most frequently photographed subjects, unquote. I did this because I knew no one had counted every single figure in the 133,063 exposures, and my budding interest in machine learning and other aspects of AI made me wary that once these tools were put in service of the digital archive, the claim might not hold up. I thought perhaps Warhol himself might be the most photographed figure in the archive. In other words, I was aware that in addition to preserving Warhol's 11-year photographic performance practice and making his exposures available for scholars and other interested people, the digitization process was also transforming Warhol's analog black and white photographs into data. That is, while we were busily investigating a newly discovered body of work and making it making it accessible to those interested in Warhol, we were also erasing the material specificity, the deformities that bruise and swell the contact sheets themselves. I was keenly aware of the irony of the obligations involved in preserving art history while working literally next door to people who were inventing and shaping technologies that would allow unparalleled access to their digital surrogates, even as they flattened and distorted the contact sheets themselves. This simultaneous sense of thrill about helping bring a huge amount of new material to art history, and a complex anxiety about how new technologies might undercut or rewrite this history before the ink was really dry, did not spark joy, to use a Kondoism. I was deeply anxious to be writing a book devoted to the contact sheets when I myself lacked the capacity to look at every single exposure and every figure in every exposure. The full archive would only be fully comprehensible, to a few devoted scholars who had the time to devote themselves to the scale of the archive. Thus, machine learning and digital tagging will be crucial to the future of Warhol's archive. The artist who declared he wanted to be a machine in the 1960s may finally get something of this wish. Warhol's declaration of this desire to be a machine came before what I view as his greatest intervention in the field of performance. In 1967, Warhol signed a contract with the American Program Bureau, the firm established by Robert Walker to bring notable speakers to college campuses. Warhol agreed to make appearances at some 42 colleges and universities, show a film, and conduct a Q&A session after. But the job quickly became impossible for Warhol, who disliked meet and greets, small towns, and small planes. But rather than cancel the contract, which he viewed as part of his bringing home the bacon tasks, Warhol hired an actor, Alan Maget, to make the appearances on his behalf. Maget, a member of the Cherokee Nation, looked nothing like Warhol. So he powdered his olive skin with white powder, a powder called, fittingly, Erase, donned a leather jacket, and rehearsed his part by repeating Warhol's signature phrases, "Wow, cool," and by mimicking Warhol's way of asking the interviewer what he or she thought about the matter raised. Eventually, the ruse was exposed by a sharp-eyed graduate student in Lincoln, Nebraska, who had a copy of the Village Voice with a photograph of Warhol in it, insisting that the magazine's copy's image was more authentic than the living man before him. The student brought the performance to the attention of the dean. Warhol was accused of fraud, and he and the Walker Agency, the Program Bureau, were sued. In his defense, Warhol consistently claimed that Maget was much better at being Andy Warhol than he himself could ever be. The universities wanted an original, but they got a copy, an actor who was much easier, everyone agreed, to work with than Warhol himself. The universities believed their invitations were a way of paying the artist a compliment, while Warhol preferred to skip the compliment and take the payment. Warhol's claim that Maget, he changed his name. It's spelled midget, but after a period, he prefers to be called Maget. He's actually passed now, but was better at carrying out the demands of that appearance, exposed the work involved in appearance, a lifelong interest for Warhol. And I think Jonathan Flatley's paper addressed that as well. Ironically now, universities are the driving force behind the acceleration of digital surrogates, because pretty much everyone believes they are much easier to work with than real material objects. The AI that will likely be most determining for the next phase of Warhol's digital surrogates, derived from his contract sheets, was developed by our Stanford colleague, Fei Li. Known as ImageNet, it is a visual recognition logarithm that learns how to read images and to assess their accuracy. Amazon, Google, and a variety of newspaper organizations use it as the core of their own platforms and cloud software. I will close with a few examples of what the most recent upload produced. To put it simply, the results are mixed. Okay, so here is, just notice, part of the digital surrogacy prohibits people from just printing. So we have this logo of the foundation on each of the individual files. Okay, but if you upload that, you get 100% accuracy. This is indeed Andy Warhol. But that's an easy one. If he has a shadow, the results are no celebrity recognized. If he's in drag, look out, Juliet Stevenson. And with a 68% confidence rating. And poor Dolly Parton is turned into, oh, did I show you? Oh, Phyllis Diller, yeah. Okay, so lots more to say, but thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. That was really great. Now, I'm going to make that quote again, but now I know that John Gold is not the most photographed subject in the... Oh, okay. But I just wanted to start by thanking Megan and Izzy for this invitation, and for Donna also for the invitation for this conference, and to Wright as well for the catalog. And everyone has been talking about how wonderful the show is, and I've been saying a lot that I think it's Warhol all grown up a little. And also Donna really has this conception of early Warhol that shows a lot about late Warhol. So I'm going to present kind of a different side to Warhol. We've been showing many different sides of him today, and I take a slightly different approach. I start with these two quotes from the Diaries in 1981. I've got these desperate feelings that nothing means anything, and then I decide that I should try to fall in love, and that's what I'm doing now with John Gold. But then it's just too hard. I'm going to the doctor, who puts crystals on you, and it gives you energy. John's gotten interested in that kind of stuff, and he says it gives you powers. And I think it sounds like a good thing to be doing. Health is wealth. Nearly 30 years have passed since Warhol's retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in 1989, and the perception of his work and legacy has shifted quite dramatically. Warhol the queer artist, Warhol the filmmaker, Warhol the photographer have all emerged in new lights. If Robert Rosenblum in his catalog essay Warhol is Art History for the first retrospective could pitch the artist as a painter situated safely within the canon, the discourse is now expanded to recognize the sexual and transgressive nature of Warhol's practice through a discussion of queer politics and cultural studies. While the literature has blossomed since the 1990s, a need for revision remains. There has still been a tendency to stretch Warhol to please the needs of various postmodern camps. And the repetition in the narrative has led to a scholarly imbalance, an almost fetishistic focus on Warhol's output of the 1960s. His final paintings remain neglected, and a serious investigation has yet to be undertaken. In particular, the divide between the readings of the queer Warhol and of the religious Warhol have perpetuated a misunderstanding of his Last Supper paintings and his response to the AIDS epidemic. What would it look like if these two camps merged? In the final decade of his life, sparked by collaborations with young artists Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring, Warhol returned to painting by hand on a dramatic scale and with new energy. He also spent this period sealing his place in the canon, engaging contemporary issues of technology, while appropriating details from Renaissance and modern masters, ranging from Botticelli to Raphael and de Chirico. No theme compares in number to the nearly 100 works in Warhol's Last Supper series, produced between 1985 and 86. The dilemma in the current literature on these paintings is that it often makes little reference, and sometimes no reference at all, to the major crisis affecting Warhol's community at the time of their completion, the AIDS crisis. The ambiguity in the writing of the last decade of Warhol's career stems in part from the conflict between his Byzantine Catholic faith and his homosexuality. This tension is often ignored in discussions of the work, with the result that the paintings appear one-dimensional. Warhol made productive use of this tension across his entire career, alternately flaunting and concealing his sexuality in his work. Once these issues are brought to the forefront, a broader concern with mourning and salvation emerges as the crux of the Last Supper paintings. In 1984, Alexander Yolas, an Egyptian-born former ballet dancer and an eccentric collector of surrealist and other early modernist art, commissioned Warhol to create a series of paintings and prints based on Leonardo da Vinci's iconic Last Supper. Warhol's final exhibition during his lifetime, Warhol Iconocula, featured at least 20 of these works and was staged in 1987 in the refectory of Milan's Palazzo della Stellina, which then housed the bank Credito Valentinese. This venue was selected for its proximity to Leonardo's masterwork, which was painted between 1495 and 98, just across the street in the refectory of the Dominican cloister Santa Maria delle Grazie. While Warhol exhibited a modest sampling of paintings and prints in Milan, he had spent a year from 85 to 86 producing 100 additional renditions of the Last Supper. The commission was the last of the artist's career, and in prophetic fashion, these images of the eve of Christ's crucifixion marked the end of Warhol's own career and indeed his life. Just a month after returning to New York from the opening in Milan, he was admitted to the hospital for gallbladder surgery and died. Warhol's production in relation to the Last Supper is remarkable for its quantity and diversity, including works on paper, large-scale paintings, and even the sculpture The 10 Punching Bags, a collaborative work created with Basquiat. Warhol employed two distinct methods and styles in these works, one in which stayed closer to Leonardo's original by screen printing a photograph of an engraving, the other which he departed from it by commingling hand-painted images of Christ with commercial logos and text pulled from newspaper headlines and advertisements. Ultimately, both versions present commentaries on suffering, one through repetition, the other through signs and symbols. Few works of art are as celebrated and studied as the Last Supper, yet the original, as Leonardo executed it on the refectory wall, has not existed for more than 500 years. Painted with an experimental technique on dry plaster, the image began to deteriorate within a few years of its completion. Shifting trends in conservation and decades of painstaking repair have only succeeded in salvaging select details. Yet time has not muted the emotional vibrancy of the disciples or the complexity of the perspective lines and dueling gestures among the figure's hands and feet, which symbolically point within and beyond the pictorial field. No matter how faded by age, these elements continue to perplex and inspire art enthusiasts and scholars worldwide. Art historian Leo Steinberg contended that the strength of Leonardo's masterwork lies in its inherent duplicity. Since the 19th century, writers have argued over which event, the revelation of Christ's betrayer or the celebration of the Eucharist, is more clearly indexed by the dramatic gestures among the disciples. Adding to the sustained interest in the work is the way it's studied, often from copies, engravings, and other reproductions that have varied over time as the original has deteriorated. Leonardo's Last Supper is a kind of meaning machine. Warhol's screen-printed canvas from 1986, such as Pink Last Supper, Camouflage Last Supper, and 60 Last Supper, oscillate between flatness and illusionistic depth, ideas that lie at the heart of Renaissance painting. His source for these canvases was a photograph of a print similar to a widely distributed engraving made in 1800 by Raphael Morgan. The hand-painted series, meanwhile, drew from an image in the Encyclopedia of Painters' Paintings, first published in 1885. In the way he looked to these sources, this process was not dissimilar from that of the other scholars and enthusiasts before him. Many celebrated writers of the Enlightenment, for example, such as Goethe, based their studies on Morgan's engraving, a copy that left out the symbolic wine glass under Christ's right hand. Warhol, who worked throughout his career with reproductions as source material, understood the inevitable loss or change of meaning in the facsimile. He also understood how a reproduction can exist in suspended time. By the 1980s, he had fully embraced contemporary media. Sorry, I just have to move ahead. He had fully embraced contemporary media, television, photography, and even the Amiga computer, and had launched his own television show, Warhol TV, which aired from 1980 to 1982. This was also a photograph that I added in this morning of him in 1962 with the Campbell Soup paintings, and he's there in front of a tiny television in the back. So I'm really interested in thinking about Warhol and television and just how we understand and see images through media. Culture has mediated experience as the appropriate lens through which to view these paintings. In his handling of color, pink, red, yellow, and camouflage, or as in the expansive, sorry, just have 60 Last Suppers, with its abutting black and white rectangles that look like stacks of miniature television screens, Warhol created a meditation on the shifting nature of death and suffering in the face of modern media. These were only the latest episodes in a sustained engagement with the fusion of mourning and media that he started in the early 60s with his Death and Disaster series, which framed death through a screen printing technique mirroring the 16mm film strip. Warhol created these paintings among his most celebrated in 63 and 64, copying scenes of suicides and car accidents from periodicals such as Newsweek and Life. For a suicide painting in 63 titled 1947 White, he sourced a life photo by Robert Wiles of a young woman, Evelyn McKaylee, a 23-year-old who had leapt to her death from the 86th floor of the Empire State Building. The young woman landed on the roof of a limousine where the vehicle's twisted metal perfectly cradled her fall, leaving her body miraculously unmarked and her posture frozen like a sleeping beauty. Warhol printed this image in an overlapping sequence that mirrors the shape and structure of the film strip. The repetition and movement in works like this one heighten and disrupt the trauma of the original event. The victims take on saint-like qualities as their suffering becomes beautiful. As if revisiting this technique, Warhol printed his Last Supper paintings with this similar formal reference to the moving image. Sorry, I think I've read this again. Through the shadowed abstraction and camouflage Last Supper and the tightly framed grid in 60 Last Suppers, repetition and printing techniques both nullify and heighten the spiritual strength and the drama of the original. In 1947 White, I'm going to skip ahead. I have an extra page in the way this printed. The logic of, in 1947, White, Warhol overlapped the frames of the silkscreen and had created a sense of movement by printing the image from light to dark, a visual effect that mirrored the flicker and motion of a film strip. In 60 Last Suppers and other works, the repetition is static, locking the image in time. The logic of the shift may reflect the moment at which these images were frozen, a moment of public suffering for the homosexual body. In the 1980s, branded in the media as the primary bearer of AIDS, the gay male body became a symbol of moral and physical decay. Because the spectacle of AIDS involved repeated images of withered and wrinkled bodies of the ill, as Simon Watney has argued, any possibility of positive sympathetic identification with actual people with AIDS was entirely expunged from the field of vision. Instead, political and public commentary on the crisis relayed between the image of the miraculous authority of clinical medicine and the faces and bodies of individuals who clearly disclosed the stigmata of their guilt. The principal target of the sadistically punitive gaze, Watney continues, was the body of the homosexual. Created at the height of the AIDS crisis, Warhol's Last Supper series generated a startling number of works showing the face of Christ in the eve of his death. I'm going to go forward here. Given the punitive rhetoric directed at homosexual men during this period, it is surprising that what scholarship exists on this series has been notably silent on the cultural climate of their creation. The author responsible for the most extensive writing on Warhol's religious works, Jane Dillenberger, whose research traces a trajectory from the artist's Byzantine Catholic upbringing in Pittsburgh to the Last Supper Commission, Dillenberger, a theologian as well as an art historian, seems to have found AIDS too taboo, since she makes no reference to the epidemic in her book. It is not only in the work of traditional art historians and scholars of religion, however, that Warhol's response to the epidemic is misunderstood. Contemporary theorists have neglected this topic as well. The first collection of critical essays on queer politics, Pop Out, Queer Warhol, maintains a near silence on Warhol's religious life. Here, Jonathan Flatley, who is here with us today, and hopefully we can talk more about this afterwards, in an otherwise persuasive essay on the complexities of identification in Warhol's practice, argues that Warhol failed the AIDS movement with his depressing depiction of the crisis in his 85-86 canvas AIDS Jeep Bicycle. But Warhol's commingling of commercial branding and images of Christ in these works commented on the cultural climate of the time in ways that even the most thoughtful commentators have overlooked. By the early 1980s, the AIDS epidemic was beginning to gain public recognition in major cities in the United States, abroad, New York, San Francisco, and Paris. The syndrome first came to wide public notice with an article in the New York Times in 1981 under the headline, "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals," which shared reports from doctors in New York and San Francisco who were diagnosing homosexual men with a rapidly fatal form of cancer. Out of the 41 patients tested, 8 died less than 24 months after the diagnosis. Panic and anxiety spread quickly within the homosexual community, and the term gay cancer was adopted to describe the disease. By 82, the Times had firmly connected the disease with homosexual communities through the headline, "New Homosexual Disorder Worries Health Officials." From 81 onward, it became more alarming as public figures and celebrities, most famously Rock Hudson, began to die of AIDS. The first mention of gay cancer in Warhol's diaries came on February 6, 1982, not even a year after the New York Times article in reference to Joe McDonald, a male model whom the artist had photographed in the 1970s and who would die of AIDS in 83. Warhol recounts, "I went to Jane Cowley's place at 810 Fifth Avenue where she was having a birthday party for her son Charlie. Joe McDonald was there, but I didn't want to be near him and talk to him because he just had gay cancer. I talked to his brother's wife." Just a few months later, in reference to the New York Times directly in the diary, Warhol says on Tuesday, May 11, 1982, "The New York Times had a big article about gay cancer and how they don't know what to do with it, that it's epidemic proportions. And they say that these kids who have it all the time have it in their semen, and they've already had every kind of disease there is, hepatitis 1, 2, and 3, and mononucleosis. And I'm worried that I could get it by drinking out of the same glass or just being around these kids who go to the baths." In each of the 8 references to gay cancer in the Andy Warhol diaries, Warhol expresses fear of contracting the disease from the most casual of encounters, and the underlying tone of his remarks is loaded with judgment. Warhol's anxiety about health and illness had started during his youth with an early onset of St. Vitus's dance, and his fear of hospitals unquestionably mounted after his shooting in '68. But his attention to health and alternative medicines and physical fitness peaked in the 1980s, a period of growing public paranoia over AIDS and the social targeting of homosexual men. His work began to reflect these worries in '85 and '86 with paintings such as Be a Somebody with a Body, in which he juxtaposed bodybuilder imagery with benevolent images of Christ, the same Christ seen in the Last Supper works. Given Warhol's preoccupation with disease and illness, it is easy to imagine the shock he would have felt in '85 when he found out that his then boyfriend, John Gold, had been admitted to the hospital with pneumonia. A little more than 2 years later, in September '86, Gold had died from AIDS at the age of 33. These are other, I'm going to get to this painting, but another interesting body of work during this period are these large physiological diagrams. He does them in painting, and he does print portfolios and drawings of this subject matter as well. Despite an age difference of 25 years, Gold and Warhol were involved for 4, traveling together, working together, and for a short period living together. When Gold met Warhol, he had just landed a competitive producing position with Paramount Pictures, a former student in Harvard's Radcliffe publishing program, and from a wealthy New England family, he had a certain pedigree that attracted the artist. And as Bob Colacello would write, old money, Harvard, Hollywood, it was a resume that Andy couldn't resist. And there was something else about John that drew Andy towards him. Like Jed Johnson, he had a twin brother named Jay. Warhol's infatuation with Gold comes out in his diaries, which at times has a tone of desperation. An entry of June 12, 1981, just 6 months after the relationship started, Warhol writes candidly, "John was back in town and he said that he thought I was going away, so he'd made plans to go away for the weekend. So I guess my whole relationship's fallen apart. He said he'd call me, but he didn't, which was mean. I have to pull myself together and go on. I have to get a whole new philosophy. I don't know what to do. I watched Urban Cowboy, and John Travolta just dances so beautifully. It was a really good movie, a Paramount movie, so that made me think more about John, and I felt worse. I cried myself to sleep." Beyond the 100 entries in the diaries, Gold is one of the most photographed subjects of Warhol's late career, appearing in over 400 of the 3,600 contact sheets the artist produced between '76 and '87. Warhol's interest in Gould's muscular physique and youthful athletic acumen is apparent in hundreds of photographs of Gould shirtless, jogging, sunbathing. Gold was a complicated figure in Warhol's life and a source of tension within his close-knit circle of employees, but what Warhol seemed most to appreciate was Gold's closeted sexuality, his insistence on hiding their relationship. Warhol writes in the diaries, "I love going out with John because it's like being on a real date. He's tall and strong, and I feel that he can take care of me, and it's exciting because he acts straight, so I'm sure people think that he is." This form of secrecy fit in well with Warhol's lifelong practice of both flaunting and concealing his own sexuality. Their relationship also satisfied his concern with putting his love interests to work. The possibility of using Gold to land a movie deal at Paramount and the blurring of the work with pleasure was part of the mystery of their love affair. As Warhol reveals in the diaries, "Oh, but from now on I can't talk personally about John to the diary because I told him I did, and he got mad, and he told me never to do it again, and that if I ever put anything personal about him in the diary, he'd stop seeing me. So from now on, it'll just be the business angle in the diary. He'll just be a person who works at Paramount Pictures who I'm trying to do scripts and movies with." I also love these cards in the diaries from John. This one as well. Given the emotional tenor of Warhol's writing on Gold in the diaries, his anxiety over the discovery that the AIDS virus had been incubating in the body of the young man whose bed he had shared seems undeniable. The details of their physical intimacy has been the subject of rumors and speculation, but it is to some degree irrelevant here since Warhol and much of the public at the time believed that AIDS could be transmitted by casual contact. In the published edition of the diaries, the first mention of Warhol's knowledge of Gold's illness appears as an editor's note inserted in the entry for Saturday, February 4th, 1984. The dueling voices in the passage function like the slippages and tears in the Death and Disaster series. Warhol says, did a personal errand with John, but he made me promise not to put anything personal about him in the diary. And then there's a bracketed quote from the editor or from Pat Hackett. John Gould was admitted to the New York hospital with pneumonia on February 4th, 1984, and released on February 22nd. He was readmitted the next day, however, and released again on March 7th. On that day, Andy instructed his housekeepers, Nina and Aurora, quote, "From now on, wash John's dishes and clothes separate from mine." Warhol's inability to speak about and record loss in the diaries is the mirror of his depictions of the death and disasters, and the slippages and tears on these canvases from 63 and 64 function as how Foster has argued as a form of traumatic realism. For Foster, the work repeats a traumatic image of the real in order to defend against it by draining it of its significance, but the real nevertheless pokes through in the form of a repeated emotional detail or a technical flaw. Foster compares this underlying current to the Roland Barthes idea of the punctum, the element in the photograph that rises from the scene and shoots out like an arrow, pierces me. I find this process of screening the traumatic also at work in the diaries, which, like the time capsules, present an obsessive recording of daily life and a false sense of intimacy. In the published version, the endless entries of the mundane, taxi receipts, dinner checks, party invitations, gossip, work to repress the real, while editors' notes, such as those on Gould's illness and later on his death, rupture the illusion to reveal a slippage of truth, piercing like the punctum to let the real through. Warhol writes, "Susan Pyle called and said she got a job at 20th Century Fox that starts in October, so she's leaving Paramount. And the diary can write itself on the other news from LA, which I don't want to talk about." And in a bracket note, John Gould died on September 18th at the age of 33 after an extended illness. He was down to 70 pounds and he was blind. He denied even to his closest friends that he had AIDS. In entries like this one, the outside world intrudes upon the fantasy of the diaries, and the crisis in Warhol's personal life becomes all the more clear. What goes unsaid, consideration of the socio-political climate in which Warhol was producing the Last Supper paintings and of his private relationship with Gould allows the link between AIDS and these works to start to emerge. In fact, he began this series, which turned out to be his last, within days of Gould's death. The tension between Warhol's sexuality and his religious life has its fullest expression in a painting like this, The Last Supper, the Big C, in which signs and symbols create a coded reference to AIDS, hand-painted via a projection process, like his 61-62 paintings, Before and After, Wigs, and Dr. Scholl's Corns. The canvas is partially unfinished, and Warhol employs a light touch with an abstract brushstroke. On the canvas, the figure of Christ recurs 4 times, while hands appear repeatedly. Thomas's finger, pointing to the sky, intimating that heaven knows he is free of guilt, appears prominently next to the eye in the Wise Potato Chip logo. So there's the AIDS. And pulled from a New York Post headline, the phrase "the big C appears under," The phrase "the big C appears under Christ's face" in the lower left center of the canvas. For Dillenberger, the phrase references Warhol's fear of cancer, but this account tells only half the story. The source material for the painting in the archives of the Andy Warhol Museum is a collage made of headlines from the New York Post, motorcycle ads, and clippings. Reading "the big C and AIDS" cut from a front page article in the New York Post. Warhol ultimately left out the AIDS headline while keeping the more covert "the big C." But given the direct references to gay cancer in his diaries, it becomes clear that this image of Christ was connected for him to the rapid rate at which people were dying around him. The big C was synonymous with AIDS. The Last Supper, the big C, reflects on sex and shame through appropriated images of Christ's betrayal, the piercing owl's eye, the number 699 appropriated from the price tag $6.99, but indexing both the sexual position 69 and the mark of the beast 666. Even the details of Christ's feet at the far right of the canvas seem to point to the notion of punishment. For Steinberg, writing on Leonardo's Last Supper, says, "As Christ's feet rejoin the rest of the body, they foreshadow it glorified, they foreshadow it crucified." The image of Christ offering his flesh in the Eucharist was a symbol of salvation during a time of suffering, an unusually personal and emotional image for Warhol. In keeping with the complexities of his construction of death and the death and disasters, and with its repression in the diaries, the paintings speak of sex and judgment. It is an allegorical triangulation of mourning, punishment, and fear. Warhol's one canvas referencing AIDS directly, AIDS Jeep Bicycle, is misrepresented in Pop-Out as the artist's only response to the crisis. Seen apart from the Last Supper, the big C, this painting may feel like an anomaly, with its unusual juxtaposition of seemingly disparate objects. It's a large canvas, and it has broad sweeping brushstrokes very similar to the big C and an unfinished look, but its mix of advertisement images and newspaper headlines, one of them an oversized headline, AIDS, mirroring the style of the contemporaneous, the big C, and also this large double weightlifter. The source material for these 2 paintings in the archives reveals, in fact, they were connected. I see them as sister canvases. Warhol's allegorical response to the epidemic becomes more obvious when these 2 works are considered in concert. Warhol Iconocula, the first exhibition of the Last Supper series in Milan, came at a moment when the disease was manifesting powerfully within Warhol's direct circle. Jolas, the gallerist who gave him his first exhibition in New York in '52, as it turned out his last, died of AIDS just 5 months after the opening in Milan. When the show opened in January, Jolas was in the advanced stages of the illness and was relegated to a sanatorium. Warhol surely felt that the disease was surrounding him. Death, which Warhol had portrayed through Saint-like Beauty and 47 White and Crucifixion in White Burning Car, is embodied in the depiction of Christ in the Last Supper paintings as a personal meditation on shame and salvation. Discussing Warhol's work in Pop-Out flatly explores the complex workings of identification, what he calls the poetics of publicity, and the intimate relation between portraiture and mourning through a process of negation and embodiment, between being public and being a body. He states Warhol understood that to become public or feel public was in many ways to acquire the sort of distance from oneself that comes with imagining oneself dead. This argument holds true for much of the artist's work, the Marilyn Monroe paintings, for example, which hollow out their references to the star while memorializing her death. There is an oversight, however, here. The dismissal of Warhol's handling of the AIDS epidemic flatly states that Warhol's failure to address AIDS surely stemmed in part from his phobic and shame-filled relation to the illness. It is true that Warhol had a lifelong conflict, concern with illness and health expressed in his diaries and popism, but his shame was rooted in the physical expression of illness, in the daily trauma involved in trying to hide his blotchy two-tone complexion, and the severe scarring from his surgeries resulted from his shooting. His response to AIDS was intimately connected to shame that was rooted in the tensions between his religion and his sexuality. In fact, Warhol's response fits in well with Flatley's overarching argument about Warhol's insights into the public consumption of images. In the face of a spectacle devoid of compassion or positive images of people living with AIDS, Warhol's response wasn't a failure but a confession of love and fear and an expression of mourning. He gave AIDS a face, the mournful face of Christ. The source material for Last Supper, The Big C, and AIDS Jeep Bicycle, a hybrid of advertisements, bears a significant resemblance to some of Warhol's earliest source material from '61. That year, for his first pop paintings, he cut headlines and advertisements from such tabloids as the National Enquirer, and assembled the clippings into two collages, tabular images of sexual and spiritual desire. The ads make him want you, how to pray, skinny, do you want power, with God, learn meat cutting, He-Man voice, reach for greater protection. Read like a list of repressed wish fulfillments for Warhol, who in '61 was undergoing a physical and professional transformation. In '57, he had plastic surgery to reshape his nose. He started wearing wigs to cover his hair, and he discarded his Raggedy Andy wardrobe for a trendier armor of tailored suits that would work to gain entry into a hyper-masculine New York art world. His first canvases, works such as Before and After, Wigs and Strong Arms, Broad Shoulders, created before the now famous Campbell's soup cans, focused on beauty and pain, transformation and assimilation. The pairing of coded sexual language in phrases such as make him want you and learn meat cutting with instructional advertisements for prayer and divine power is echoed in Warhol's choice of black and white advertisements over 20 years later in '85 and '86, when he was working on his Last Suppers. Such paintings as Heaven and Hell Are One Breath Away, The Mark of the Beast, and Repent and Sin No More bring faith and sexuality together again, this time at a moment of intense public scrutiny of homosexuality during the moral crisis of the AIDS epidemic. The crisis during the early stages was not simply one of images, but of language. As Paula Treckler has argued, the confusion emerged from a deep symbolic constriction of how we think and speak about the disease. The scientific and medical communities were subject to the same metaphors and biases of the general population. As Treckler writes, there is a continuum then, not a dichotomy between popular and biomedical discourses, a continuum between controversies in daily life and those occurring in the laboratory, and these play out in language. The ambiguity of the medical community's language on the transmission and prevention of AIDS contributed to a rapid rate of fear and rumor in the public. At the same time, the media and medical community employed an overabundance of judgmental, moralistic, and religious language in their discussion of AIDS. In the early stages of the outbreak, cases in New York hospitals were referred to as WOGs, or the Wrath of God syndrome. More important, the contracting of AIDS was understood as the result of deviant behavior, whether through multiple sex partners, drug use, or prostitution. Given the manner in which this shame-based rhetoric took root, the public consciousness, Warhol's juxtapositions of Christ with references to gay cancer and AIDS become a clear response. Once we situate Warhol's late works within the AIDS epidemic, his series of black and white advertisement paintings take on a prescient tone in relation to the culture of fear. Private sexual lifestyles were becoming the subject of public scrutiny. The Mark of the Beast and Repent and Sin No More, for instance, point to the moralistic assault directed at gay men, which often positioned them as deviant, deserving of the full punishment of the silent killer. The image of a hand branded with the number 666 points not only to the sarcoma that often accompanied the virus, but also to the violence of the period's public discourse, which had produced the threat of branding or tattooing HIV homosexuals. This violence permeated Warhol's personal and professional world. In March 1987, just a month after Warhol's death, Larry Kramer founded the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP. A year later, Douglas Crimp published AIDS Cultural Analysis, Cultural Activism, a special edition of the journal October, while artists' collectives like Grand Fury fought to reposition the spectacle of AIDS from associations of isolation and shame to assertions of strength and community. Warhol's hand-painted religious works created just before this period of activism and resistance went unshown during his lifetime and were crafted in his studio without the direction of a commission. The scholarly discourse that has positioned his work as a failure in the face of the crisis results in part from limited viewing or research, and more still, a dismissal of the complexities of his lived experience as both homosexual and Byzantine Catholic, of the deep conflicts in his work between illness and physical perfection. In this broader view, it seems fitting that Warhol's interpretation of the AIDS crisis would find its most complete expression in Christ and the Last Supper. More than a demonstration of reverence for Leonardo's masterwork or an unveiling of his Catholic faith, Warhol's Last Supper paintings are a confession of the conflict he felt between his faith, his sexuality, and ultimately a plea for salvation during a time of suffering for the homosexual community. AIDS had generated a new way to brand bodies as frightening symbols of moral decay, targets for punishment. From this perspective, these paintings can be understood as some of the most personal and revealing works of Warhol's career. His response to the crisis, a deeply personal one, was in plain view right on the surface of his canvases.
Very happy to be up here, happy to be invited. I'd like to thank Izzy, Dow, and Megan Hoyer for their seamless organization of this event. I would also like to thank again Donna DeSalvo for her exquisite, capacious, and inspirational show, exhibition, A to B and Back Again. And for me, personally, to have the chance back again to Warhol, to revisit him in this context. Again, he always intersects my operation as an artist, so I'm very happy to have this opportunity to look at Warhol again. A quote from Candy Darling, 1968, from the movie Flesh. Things that move. I think things that move are beautiful. And from Jacques-Alain Miller, 2014, a text entitled The Unconscious and the Speaking Body. Quote, beauty is the last defense against the real. Thank you.
So from Warhola to Warhol to Warhola again. Thank you, Robert, for your presentation, and Jessica and Peggy. Really appreciate all of them. Robert, I wanted to start with you since it's fresh on our mind and we just saw this. I was thinking while this was being presented about the person who might be live streaming this event, who would then be encountering the stream from Pittsburgh that you're presenting here, this kind of simultaneity of streaming, this kind of doubleness of different kinds of presence. And I wonder what in the work or what in Warhol made you or compelled you to have this be as a response. It seems like in addition to a question of archive or accumulation, there's a different question about presence that your presentation brings. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the question. This was meant to run, how could it not, for 15 minutes, but because of time constraint, it ran for 10. I really wanted it to be close to unbearably long. Each encounter with Warhol is a different encounter. And this exhibition, as I said, gave me a new chance to think about Warhol. And the other clarification is that there is no person. That's just that's a camera on a post. So there's no agency behind that camera. I don't know if they were doing the zooming in and out from the booth, but I think it's maybe something there in the camera itself. Anyway, my confrontation with Warhol this time is that I'm not saying anything new. He's a cipher. But more than that, to me, he seems like a whole around which we... W-H-O-L-E or H-O-L-E? H-O-L-E. There's a whole, not only in the works, which are the smears, the rips, the voids, but I think in the persona of Warhol himself. I think this is what we're all here trying to figure out. But we just kind of go around this hole and maybe embroider it and make it more beautiful, bring meaning, create meaning effects. And I don't know what else I could add to that. I feel like this image and this feed says more than I ever could. More specifically, sitting here watching it now on a large screen, I was appreciative of the fact that you cannot really read the headstone. That the headstone is almost like itself a rip or a tear or an anomaly in one of his canvases. And so that was very, enjoyable for me, because there is this kind of continuum, but then also, and finally, Perpetual Warhol.
That was a Warhol Museum project, and it actually screens every day in the lobby of the Warhol Museum, which is a little weird, I guess. But you can also see people like setting up camp there, and for his birthday, I think they do a birthday party, and for Halloween, there's like extra stuff that happens around the grave. But his parents are also right behind him, which you can kind of see in the screen. So, yeah.
But also the idea of like death, right? But then there's life. The lantern moving, the flowers moving. I mean, I feel like so much we can go awry with Warhol when we think of like nihilism and tragedy and trauma, but I see him more on the life side in the way in which, I mean, my gosh, we're here living, breathing Warhol, so there is this way in which he does generate life and living and a certain kind of bright jouissance, if I can put it that way, living jouissance.
Kind of as a pivot from that, but for Peggy and Jessica, I was listening to your presentations and very much thinking about the question of audience, who's encountering your show or the text around the show, their expectation about what a contact does or doesn't do, what you're thinking about what the digital life, the surrogate version of that life does. And for Jessica, this kind of play between a reading of the AIDS crisis and Warhol's work that perhaps only now could be read. I could see those paintings, even if the reading had been put to them, would have been considered extremely conservative. Why would the Christ figure need to be the surrogate for the person in that period who was sick or dying? So I wonder how if you two could individually address this question of audience and kind of the timeliness of an audience receiving a show or a painting or an experience at a particular time.
Well, I do feel that we benefited from the kind of pre-press for the Whitney show. So I think that there was, and Blake might know about this as well, there's been a kind of resurgence in interest anchored by this show in Warhol. So we were very happy to be in the tide of that. And I also just think that the sheer, it is the largest coherent body of work that has come into view since Warhol's death, that generated a certain kind of, quite remarkable interest. But maybe I would also just note that, as I was briefly mentioning in the document that I wrote for the justification for Stanford to get the contact sheets, I used the metaphor from performance studies that the contact sheets were kind of rehearsals or studies. And then, and part of the trick of writing it was we were only allowed to see 3 contact sheets. So we didn't really know what was in them. And they were not very well known publicly. But then once I was in the Stanford community and also doing more work on them, I dropped the analogy to rehearsals, which was not getting much traction at Stanford. And I used instead the analogy of a stem cell, that the frames worked as kind of stem cells. And that got a lot more traction at Stanford because that's how people talk there. So I think the audience, it's a Stanford project, and so you have to know your audience in that sense. But, it's our hope and belief that the audience will extend, Perpetual Warhol, that it will remain in perpetuity, and that, I think the future machine learning, what it will do, just to make absolutely clear what I'm talking about with counting, say there are 30 shots of a fashion show, and there are maybe 50 people in the shot. You see the first 10 or so fairly clearly, but then there are a lot of people in the back. Once this ImageNet machine learning gets better, and you can see it's got a way to go, we will be able, at least in theory, to understand what, who Warhol made contact with. Now, you could argue, was that really contact if he was in the same space-time? But from the point of view of live performance, yes, that is contact from my point of view. An art historian might say no. So this is partly the dialogue and the audience, and we hope that it will be of interest to a wide range of viewers.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with like the contact sheets and thinking about audience too with Warhol is the sort of division between the public-private, even within the contact sheets, and then kind of the private story that I sort of weave around the Last Supper. Because even take, for instance, the John Gould story. There are actually, I haven't seen photos of John, for instance, in Warhol's townhouse. Kind of like there's this quote, I talked to Christopher Makos and Peter Weiss, and Peter recalls Warhol saying once, "Oh, I finally get to come home and take off my Andy suit." And so this idea of like taking off his camera or taking off this persona at home where the camera never really captures these moments. And Christopher Makos has these photographs of John and Peter and Christopher Christopher for the holidays together in the townhouse, but they don't really show up, it seems, in the contact sheets that Peggy and Richard had. So almost, again, even this performance of jet setting, there are a lot of photographs of John and Peter and Christopher jet setting around, or going to the beach, or skiing, and private planes, and celebrities, and all of these things, and that kind of becoming for an audience almost, in a way, those contact sheets. So there really does seem to be a really fascinating public-private, and that's why I find these editor's notes in the diaries really interesting, that Warhol doesn't insert them in a way, even though these are diaries considered to be private recordings, but they're really very performative in a way as well, of keeping relationships talked about in a specific manner, keeping emotion about death repressed in some way. So public audience with Warhol, I think, is really interesting. But definitely thinking about what the distance, social distance we have now on the way we talk about AIDS or can understand AIDS now, and getting away from the fear and the paranoia. And I think sometimes that's forgotten in discussions of Warhol, that he was human and had this fear as well. I mean, he does say several times in the diaries a fear that people think that he is sick or that he does have AIDS. So, yeah.
I think one of the things that's interesting about what you're saying about what is chosen to be included and not is that even with this sheer mass of materials, whether it's textual or object-based, there's already a real editing process, whether it's censoring or whether it's a manufacture of self-presentation. We seem to think, or at least I do, that you have all this stuff, and then it's this accumulation that kind of is separate from an idea of an archive. But there is, even in the mass, so much choice, and I wonder if, you know, in both of your projects and working with this, you see what accumulation can do differently than what and kind of an edited accumulation can do, rather than something that's more self-selected, or I would say it's even rigorous in its accumulation, and what that brings.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear from Melissa and the 20,000 pages that you mentioned of the diaries, the time capsules, etc. You know, it is Perpetual Warhol because so much of it still has not been assessed. So I think there's that level. And then I think also there's this almost OCD, or a kind of a perpetual habit of documentation as well, that wasn't meant, in my view, to ever really be processed by Warhol, that he had a very deep sense of the Warhol to come, and he was preparing for that. And many of the contact sheets have no editing marks whatsoever. So they were printed, and we have the negatives, but either nobody looked at them, which is possible, or nobody liked anything that they saw on them, which is another possibility. But these all remain at the level of the possible. But the last thing I'll just say about Jessica's really important point, there are very few, almost none, pictures inside the townhouse. So there was this barrier, or this sense of outside is the stage. And the last thing I'll just say is that I think unwittingly, he also did a really powerful documentation of the transformation of Times Square. So over 11 years, you can really see how Times Square moves from burlesque, peep show kind of thing to not quite as Disneyfied as we have by 87, but it's on its way. And also Union Square, but it's not as dramatic with Union Square. So he becomes a kind of accidental documentarian. And so, you know, for people in urban studies or architecture or so on, there are many lost cities that are, or lost buildings anyway. One of my favorites is called, it's a store that I was very fond of because I used to work at NYU and I would pass it all the time on 8th. And it's called The Forgotten Woman. And, you know, you won't be shocked to hear it was not a success, and they went bankrupt. But there are these great photographs of the Forgotten Woman. And so we have this mise en abîme of, you know, the Forgotten Woman and so on. So anyway, even though I don't think there was, so I'm saying that because I don't think there was an intentional strategy I think that there are a lot of accidental documentations that we can now find that he could not have been fully aware he was doing, in my view.
Yeah, we have at the museum these Polaroids that he took in '61, and before, he has this great tiny camera he can take around in his pocket and take a whole roll of film in a day and not worry about it, and maybe print the roll, maybe not. But the Polaroids from '61 and '62 document people coming to his townhouse. Kind of specifically, it's like the Polaroid only happens at home, and it shows other artists and poets and writers coming to the townhouse, kind of building his artistic milieu. But it also shows sort of sexual encounters, so lots of nude men. And the interesting thing about that is, one, you didn't have to take them to be processed, so no one would ever see what they actually looked like. Two, Warhol didn't clearly enjoy using the wand to fix the Polaroids, so half of them are kind of deteriorated. But also, it is this really interesting collapse of public-private that happens in that early fascination with wanting to record. But that Polaroid, in a way, was almost also treated like a party trick, like come over, because there are actually pictures of people looking at their Polaroids. So there is a really interesting, I think, in the beginning, that 60s moment, 50s moment as well, where there's a more daring, maybe more personal version of a Warhol that we get, until this real conception of a performance of the artist, or the image of the artist, starts to, I think, take shape after 62 into 63. And that's why I'm interested in that early moment of painting that happens before Campbell's Soup, and then maybe how some of those themes start to happen again in the 80s without a commission, without people really seeing them. So that's I do really think that there's a real concept. That's why I really loved your talk about midget, the double, the surrogate with Warhol, of really using the double and kind of trading voices. I mean, he does that over and over again throughout his entire body of work, but it really does take shape with fame a bit, I think, in the public eye, and a real understanding that it's out of his hands at some point, like his own image. So there's a playing with constructing it and constraining it, and then leaving it up to all of this interpretation and the press and rewriting, and ultimately rewriting his own narrative. So
I want to be sure that we have time for questions, so I would like to open the floor.
I think they're going to ask you to do
Question over here. Yep. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I especially have a really wonderful presentations, everyone, and I just wanted to ask Peggy, and I wrote all these notes down, but I'm not going to, I just want to, where'd they go? Sorry. I don't really have to look at this, but I want to. Yeah, about facial recognition.
Oh, yeah.
In the whole that you ended on, and I did this crazy project once where it's so stupid, where I took the Warhol screen tests, and this is when you could get at anything, MoMA, and I had a 16 millimeter projector, and I did it at some conference in their poster room, and then I took all these photographs and turned it into a fast video of Megan's Law and all the criminals on it. And that made me write this little paper about the relationship between early photography and criminality, and the development of typologies and criminal types that was so deeply tied to early photography. And I was thinking it would be so cool if you followed some of these relationships, because then you also think of Warhol's 13 Most Wanted Men, that then turn into 13 Most Beautiful Boys, which also turn into the screen tests. So it's this incredible idea of typology testing related to these vast archival, durational, informational projects across visual and audio and text that Warhol produced. So I wanted to know if, I just want to inspire you to think in that direction, but also wanted to know if you thought about some of those relationships with especially the facial recognition, and also the idea of misrecognition and recognition throughout Warhol's work,
Thank you so much. No, I had not thought about this. This is, for me, all brand new work. So I have, mountains to do. But what I can say, which I think, but you've given me, a lot of good guidance, so thank you. But I would say that one of the most interesting things about machine learning in terms of image recognition is that it has been the fastest critiqued of the millions of data grabs that we're undergoing. And the critique has been about its failure particularly to identify accurately African American skin. And one of the things that I was doing here is suggesting as well that that's just the tip of the iceberg, because what we haven't talked about at all, the critique has not yet been developed for any kind of identity that's non-normative hetero. So trans people or even Warhol and drag. So that was standing in for a lot of other work, which you could link to types and phrenology and some of that early photographic practice. So that's a really nice connection, which I hadn't been thinking of. But thank you.
Thank you, each of you, for your incredible presentations that, take on. I was thinking so much about, Warhol before he dies and dealing with the specter of AIDS. And I thought what was so important too, Jessica, is that, Warhol was always so good at being topical in his work. But this is something where, to a certain extent, the topicality was hidden because it wasn't out in the public realm. And, this endless notion of the contact sheets that will be the gift that keeps on taking, as you say, and I'm sure we'll be generating many more PhD theses. I don't know if that's giving or taking, so whatever. But, and Robert, your presentation, which of course harkens to, as Jessica pointed out, this live feed in the Warhol Museum lobby of, the grave of Warhol. And it just sort of struck me when, in the context of this, the topic or the framing device of Perpetual Warhol, I was thinking about, if you've ever had a loved one and you had to buy cemetery plot, you can sign up for perpetual care, which has to do with how long, and how much Warhol was so deliberate in just creating all this stuff. In some sense, we were talking earlier about this, because he had a sense of his own history. I don't know if he would have anticipated the webcam on his, on his gravestone. And the fact that it's eroded is kind of strange in such a peculiar way. But, I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about this idea of, an artist who, in a sense, he doesn't leave his position in history to chance. He absolutely makes certain he's getting his place. And, just thought if you could maybe even muse on that and other artists who have, like who is Warhol? Is there anyone we can compare him to? Artist, writer? I mean, who is he is it like a presidential library? I mean, I'm trying to keep finding some other figure that you can compare him to, and it doesn't even have to be an artist, but just curious on your thoughts on that.
I've compared him to Reagan because of this notion of the teamwork to create an identity, that the troika, as he's called, the three, Mies, Baker, and I forgot the third, Mies, Baker, Deaver, Michael Deaver, the vicar of the visuals, as he was called, created this performer named Ronald Reagan. And I think a similar kind of, first with Malanga and company, and then later with Fred Hughes and Colacello in and out, performed this thing called Andy Warhol. So I do think there's a lot of points of contact there, and the size of the archive is similar. Because Reagan is the first president to have to abide by the Freedom of Information Act, and the the post-Nixon law, the Presidential Records Act, which makes it impossible. There's going to be a good segue, which makes it illegal to destroy any communication that takes place in written form in the White House, including the Gay Men's Health Crisis made a proposal in 1984 to do a survey of all American households regarding the number of sex practices they had participated in or had knowledge of. And there were 150 sex practices listed, including golden showers and, really quite an array. And in the Ronald Reagan Library in Simi Valley are all the Post-its of all the White House staffers who read the proposal that say things like, I know 1, or I recognize 6, and I've heard of 10, but I've done 2. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act, so thanks to me, this is all part of the public record. But needless to say, they were not successful in their grant application. Anyway, so the point is the archive has all of these kinds of histories still to come.
The writer that springs to mind would be James Joyce. The historical conditions, very different, and the way in which Warhol put everyone around him to work is also quite different. Warhol, I think, would like to know that he's still putting us to work. But the idea that you cannot read Finnegan's Wake, that there is no there in a way, and the scholarship is vast. Again, around something that we'll never know, as we were speaking about the shadow paintings. There, again, he creates a kind of hole in which we all orbit around in trying to find meaning. And that's also what I meant with my 2 introductory quotes, this idea of movement. One thing that strikes me about Warhol is that he was, over and above everything, he was always on the move, the body in motion, whether it was outfitted with technology or whether it was putting others to work or at home. I can't think of any static moment in the discourse of Andy Warhol. So, yeah, to answer your question, I would compare him to James Joyce in that way. All of the scholarship and the attempts to answer something that cannot be answered.
Yeah. Oh, no, I was just going to say, I don't know if I have a direct comparison with an artist, but just thinking about the nature of the archive at the museum, which I think is interesting to think about the diaries, that there's just so much kind of trash involved in the archive. So, like there are whole time capsules of like slippers from planes and forks from restaurants and like toothpaste, like ridiculous amounts of stuff, detritus of like a life that weren't even his objects. So, but then there are these moments where you get like a love note from John Gould or an early boyfriend, or little photographs of John's face torn up from 15 prints, like in an envelope. So these little moments of like a real human behind this, what seems like hiding behind a bunch of cardboard boxes, like 610 of these time capsules that he considers a work of art, but they're literally filled sometimes with trash. So, and the archive doesn't have a law and order to it in the way at the museum that other archives do. Those boxes are kept as Warhol put them together, or idea boxes from his office are kept as idea boxes. So there isn't like a section for photography or correspondence, or, it's all kind of still within the brain of both Warhol and the chief archivist who had been at the Warhol for 30 years, Matt Warburton. So there's a real kind of nature to it that is also part of why it's still really hard to get to the bottom of anything.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah, thanks. So I was just thinking about, Peggy, your presentation and, oh, thanks, sorry. So I was thinking about, Peggy, your presentation and like the totally horrifying technology and facial recognition and artificial intelligence. And that presentation had been bookended by Richard with your kind of confronting us with biography. Like we're saying that not for 15 minutes, but for 10, which did feel like a long time to just like stare at the tombstone. And that just made me think about biography in general and that so many of us used the diaries in our research and just how we're being critical in our I don't know, our use of the text and even the photograph, this sort of source material or archival material, and oh, yeah. So I don't know. My question is really for all the panelists about what we think, how we're using biography and using this material to sort of inscribe an interior, but also trying to step back from that. So I don't know. It's an open question for everyone, but I guess it just feels like it keeps hitting home. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
I'm speaking as an artist. Some of the initial conversations that Megan and I had about this panel and art making in the 21st century was about the biography of an artist, which for many years in modernity had been verboten. These two things separated, the art from the biography. But my own vantage on this, and Megan kind of agreed, was that the further we go, these two things, it's not a necessity, but may be advantageous to see come together. And I think we're seeing this a little bit over the last 2 days. So what I'm aiming for, what I see on the horizon here, is singularity. So something beyond even the trans community, where we're just a mass of ones all alone in a kind of autistic relationship to the object. So that for me is profoundly interesting when it comes to Warhol. Because I think what he presents on the public stage, as we've just been talking here, is his singularity. You can't really get at that Mobius strip between the public and private, except to say that was his particular relationship, his singular relationship to public and private. Different from mine, different from Benjamin's, etc. So this interests me as a way that we move, as we move further into the 21st century, as a mass of singularities, each one alone with their own mode of enjoyment or jouissance. So that's where my interest lies in this still thorny question of biography and art making. And we could also say the rise of art making, not just through the university discourse, but through late capitalism as a defense against the real, which becomes closer and closer and closer. So art into the 21st century, I think, is something that's increasingly volatile, loaded, and fecund.
Well, just a word on the diaries, because I think it's a really important thing to just note that I do think that Warhol studies in the last 10 years or so, or maybe slightly longer, have assumed that the diaries is kind of the last word, and that whatever's in the diary must be true. But certainly in terms of some of the dating issues and various other things, there's a lot of fiction in the diaries, and I do think that will, eventually we'll get more of them, or, some of the work that Melissa's doing, like we will be able to be a little bit more sophisticated in our use of the diary than a kind of fact checker Although I do think it sometimes is very helpful in broad strokes of dating things. It was very helpful for us, but it's not it's not gospel, as my mother would say.
That was really an intense and very, very affecting panel. But there is a moment from the last panel, before yours, that's haunting me that I wanted to bring back and ask you guys about, which is the moment where someone at Rizzoli bookstore, I think a woman tears off Warhol's wig. And the only way that he can write about it, as Lucy narrated, is by not naming it. And so one of my worries about what we do as scholars, are we also trying to rip off the wig, and find the real Warhol underneath? And one of the things I love about Donna's show is I don't feel like it's interested in ripping off his wig at all. I think it takes the work, not as the wig, but it takes the work as the legacy that we need to grapple with. And as scholars, as we dig into this archive, I think it's important, what is it that we're looking for? And a subject that not only thinks that Alan Miget can do Warhol better than he himself can, but clearly is invested, as we saw again and again in the contact sheets, not only with himself but with others, in this idea of multiplying the self, of taking on and taking off different masks, like we saw with Elizabeth Taylor in the elephant mask. And then there's someone else putting on a donkey mask off frame, in another frame. But so here's my question. How do we not rip off the wig when, for example, we are focusing on Warhol's death, on a boyfriend? None of you ripped off the wig, but still I think these are on a boyfriend who himself insisted on the erasure of Warhol's, even though the diaries are posthumous and what I don't think were ever going to be published during Warhol's lifetime. But I'll just finish this question by saying, first of all, if we did pull off the wig, would he be recognized by your technology? I wonder. Warhol without his wig probably wouldn't be recognized by the Image Quest, or what is it called?
The broad term, ImageNet is Fei Li's
Since I'm at
logarithm.
Stanford, I should know that, but whatever.
You should know.
Right, now I do. Thank you. ImageNet. So that's my question is, when we came up with, Peggy and I came up with the title, I think I actually did, but anyway, Contact Warhol, but then I did, and Photography Without End, but you then embraced it, and you came up with many, many, many other things. But I'm good with titles. But when we discussed Contact Warhol, Peggy had this whole sort of seance thing, like, we're going to make contact, not with the Warhol, but with different Warhols. And I had never thought of that, sort of paranormal. But when I was listening to your papers and being zoomed into the grave and then learning the gravesite is there, which I didn't even see when we were at the Warhol Museum every day, that is bizarre. And then the soup cans on top of the grave and the ketchup and the Coke. It seems like there is this desire to return both to a biographical, embodied, or lost Warhol, and this continual multiplication or perpetual interest in the afterlife of Warhol. I think Warhol is more popular now than he ever was during his lifetime. I think also his death allowed people not to deal with certain aspects of his freakiness. And so, so I just wonder what you think about that. Yeah, not pulling off the wig. Do you worry about that?
No, I have no hope to, no. I think partially what I'm trying to talk about is the scale of the thing makes pulling off the wig impossible. That said, however, I thought hearing it in Lucy's incredible talk, the line that really, I've read that account many times, but somehow hearing it in your mouth, maybe after listening to Jonathan Flatley talk so well about lips, when it came from your lips into my ear, I did really hear. It reminded me of the shooting. That comparison was so striking. And I think that for lots of reasons, the shooting, Valerie Solanas' act in 1968 has, as Donna's show also, suggests, has made a very big demarcation in Warhol's studies, prior to the shooting and after the shooting. But it may be more than the shooting. I mean, it may be this weird thing that Warhol said on many occasions, and it was based in truth. I have been pronounced dead, so I'm not sure where this is taking place. And it's an incredible statement, and particularly it's an incredible statement, if anybody has an appetite, it's an incredible statement for anybody who's interested in Catholic theology. So this question that the Last Supper that you talked about so well, and even be somebody with a body, and then 3 pictures of Christ. This is probably more than this audience wants, but it's really interesting. Thomas Aquinas wrote particularly about this question of the corporeality of Christ in relation to, should an artist include blood in the post-resurrected Christ? So the theology goes that after he died, he came back, and there's a famous Caravaggio, the incredulity of St. Thomas. But the discourse around whether or not the body, after it's been dead, contains and comes back, contains blood, is a really deep and interesting question for Catholics and for other people as well. So this idea that Warhol would raise the question, where is this conversation taking place since I have been pronounced dead? That's what I was partially alluding to when I was saying about the human and the machine combined can have a salvatory, they have a salvatory possibility. So that even, there's a lot of people right now who are considered alive, but only because they have machines in them at various points. Anyway, this is like way more than we probably want to get into, but it is, in my view, very, very interesting.
Yeah, so being at the museum all the time and being around all of the objects all the time, and honestly listening, when you do listen to some of these tapes, because I've only listened to one of them actually that Claire Henry brought my attention to, and Warhol's flirting like really heavily with David Bourdon, and they actually make out at one point on the tape, and they're drinking, and it's like a side of him that you don't ever hear, ever really, or this idea that he's human while he's doing this performance all the time in a certain way. He is also human, and so I don't know if it's necessarily wanting to pull back the wig all the time, but often I'm interested in finding the slippage in his performance, maybe, this moment, even when the archive doesn't hold up to the performance. So that kind of interests me. And then also in the way that the work is talked about, that maybe there are slippages there as well, as how do we look at the story of some of Warhol underneath the wig. I don't know. Just because there was so much trauma involved in his bodily experience from a young age and the way that he presents it. Donna starts the show with these college drawings that are so peculiar of vomiting faces, or a woman suckling a pig, or picking the nose, and just really contorted, unhappy bodies that are very different than Philip Prostine, his classmate at the time, who did very lovingly depictions of his parents, and a great image of Warhol in art class, Andy in art class, that we have at the museum. So Warhol does have a particular presentation of bodies and glamour, I think, from a point of pain. And as the talk that Ken gave at the very end of Edie Sedgwick, the white glamorous girl, and that sort of violence of all of that, and then the Melania Trump image. I don't know, there's something also interesting to think about. The beauty, the light of beauty that Warhol gives people isn't often one of a warm glow in any way. It's usually quite depressing.
Do we have to end? Should we end?
You could.
We can't
The
end
last
that
word is John.
This is a great panel and a great conference, and it's been great to be here and to listen to everything and just to sort of talk about all this Warhol stuff with other people who've been thinking about Warhol for a long time. And to hear that essay quoted made me realize that he was like, I wrote that like 25 years ago or something. Like, oh yeah, I have been working on Warhol for a long time. But so I wanted to just ask about the AIDS Jeep bicycle painting, and I think it's really smart to think about the Last Suppers as a kind of response to the AIDS crisis, and in particular, so in that essay, I was thinking about the relationship between abstraction and embodiment, portraiture and mourning. And making the case that AIDS Jeep bicycle painting was a sort of departure from the way that he usually addressed those things, which seemed especially striking in relation to Grand Fury's appropriation of direct appropriation of Warholian appropriation techniques. Sort of like Warhol sort of, there's like a gap, it marks a departure or a sort of, for Warhol from his own operating practice. And what I was sort of struck by was the bicycle and the Jeep there's no people in them, right? Whereas he's sort of elsewhere constantly interested in this tension between recognition and absence. There it's like it's just absence. And so, but to think about that in relation to the Last Suppers, I think someone else was saying this as well. There's difficulties about thinking about that as a response to AIDS also, especially since the Catholic Church precisely at that moment was a chief agent of the spectacularization and pathologization of the gay male body, which I think also was part of why it was so hard for Warhol to respond to the AIDS crisis as he had responded to earlier events of mass grief in his life because of that, because gay embodiment at that moment became this sort of totally different thing. And you can sort of imagine how, as like a gay man at that time, it would be sort of this totally, difficult thing to think about and to work through. And so, to think about the Last Suppers as a response to the AIDS crisis also seems to me, I think as you suggested, it's also very closeted, right? It also contrasts with the gay men's health crisis or ACT UP's response right after. But my question then is, and Peggy was sort of getting at this too, you suggested in the paper, but I'm sure you have more thoughts about it, how the Last Suppers and the figure of Christ in particular is a response to this particular tension in Warhol, or this consistent interest in Warhol and exploring the relationship or the tension between embodiment and abstraction, which now I think of as also a theological problem, not only as a problem having to do with the logic of the public sphere, but I feel like there's an additional point there that I'd be interested to hear about how Christ in particular as this figure responds to that issue, especially. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, I'm interested. I was interested in outside of just this topic, interested in Warhol's depiction of Christ, and then this reflection on the bodybuilder or a perfect body, or Christ being this idolized figure, hairless, lean, muscular, and a sexualized Christ. And in the contact sheets, actually, there's a day when he goes to the beach with John Gold, and he photographs John as if he's crucified over a clothing line. He's hanging with his arms and his feet at the end of the clothing line. And there's 4 or 5 shots of him depicted this way. So some of what I was interested in...
And it's in the book.
Yeah, it's actually in the book, blown up, one of the images. But I was really interested in this idea of a sexualized Christ with Warhol and seeing Christ in a sexual way. And then Be a somebody with a body of being depictions of health or strength during a time in which that meant you were sort of free of shame or free of AIDS. Withered bodies were depicted everywhere, and health and working out. Warhol also starts this very intense exercise regime. He starts wearing crystals all the time. John Gould does the same. He's sick, though, so he goes to Nepal to seek help, actually, with all these sort of spiritual teachings, but this whole idea that there wasn't a clear understanding of how it was expressing itself, AIDS. So I think the image with Christ for me, with Warhol, was this idea of forgiveness and also benevolence during a time when that wasn't really talked about at all. So that's where I was going with that. But really that be a somebody with a body in black light. That's what doesn't show up there, but that painting is like the Playboy painting that Donna has in the show, is meant to be seen under black light. And when you do see it under black light, there are additional flecks of paint that really do make it look like this mournful Christ, as if Christ is tearful, like the way the paint has fallen on the face.
I don't know.
I was very puzzled by the question, with whom can we compare Andy Warhol? And you referred to James Joyce, which I thought was wonderful, but it triggered many questions afterwards. And I was scanning my historical horizon, and I thought, well, where do we go? Like Baudelaire, Oscar Wilde, Mark Twain, moving into the 20th century, Marcel Duchamp, and Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Eva Hesse. I thought, none of them qualify. They are the greatest artists of the 20th century. Why is it always Andy Warhol that we're going back to, right? Of course, Eva Hesse is an artist that is probably in many ways infinitely more important than Andy Warhol. But we always go back to Warhol, as you said, the black hole, right? So I didn't want to have the last word. I was hoping somebody else would pick up after this. But it's really like, he is the quintessential 20th century personality. And now we're surrounded by millions of imitators, right, to walk in the street, and you have Andy Warhols practicing exactly what Andy Warhol did, perpetually photographing themselves and photographing everything else. So what is it? What is the quintessential feature? The total absence of utopian thinking, the total asociality, the post-Oedipal personality, the post-patriarchal personality, the extreme forms of total reification, and the extreme forms of total determination by an existing media culture that does not allow you any breathing space whatsoever other than the operation within that pre-established pattern. That makes you a perfect 20th century personality. And that's why it seems Andy is the one person that represents us more adequately, more precisely than any of the great artists of his generation or generations before, because they all are very specific figures who still operate within relatively traditional parameters, whereas his parameters are transcending all of those and bring us forward into the actual situations within which we find ourselves.
If I can answer, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm
No,
just
that was it.
stimulated by what you're saying. I think I would add two things. Metonymy, so not metaphor, right? It's this constant sliding, scanning, swiping, which we talked about with the shadows. I think the shadow paintings exemplify that par excellence. We don't have a referent there. It's complete horizontality. Each Instagram feed post, you have an addiction for the next one. You have this kind of incessant impulse to put the next one there, which only, it's like an event horizon. The other thing I would add is the not all. The logic of the all and the not all from Lacan. Dirty word maybe, but there it is. The not all cannot be captured by language or by metaphor. So something always escapes. There's a beyond, which Don and I were talking about last night, with Warhol really lies in those gaps or those fissures or those stains or rips or blemishes. And also, I think this is maybe an organizing way we can talk about the entire symposium, is that there is something that escapes in Warhol. Not all of Warhol can be contained. It's impossible. And he, in planning for his perpetual future, may have known this. The other analogy for me is like feathers that fall from a bird. I mean, it is litter, but just this detritus just we keep finding more. And the idea that he will never be captured, he will never be fixed, that makes him even a 22nd century artist.
I just wanted to say very quickly that I think, in contrast to Benjamin, that I think Warhol was a foundationally, fundamentally utopian artist. In his commitment, his career-long commitment to imagine and depict a world in which everybody could like everybody. I mean, it may not be your utopia, but I think it was a utopia in the sense that it was an effort to imagine a radical alternative to the world that existed.